Hi guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my first video and I am Fatma Vera. I hope my voice sounds clear to you as it is my first video and I haven't mastered the audio settings yet, and sorry about that. Okay guys, today we're gonna analyze the Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. You should read the short story because we will just analyze. Okay. The Yellow Wallpaper is a famous short story written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It was first published in 1892 and has since become a significant work in feminist literature. The story revolves around a woman's descent into madness as she becomes obsessed with the patterns in the yellow wallpaper of her room. It is a powerful exploration of gender roles, mental health, and social expectations during the 19th century. Okay, let's start the character list. We are seeing the three characters: the narrator, John, and Jenny. Okay, the narrator, a young, upper-middle-class woman, newly married and a mother who is undergoing care for depression. The narrator, whose name may or may not be Jane, is highly imaginative and natural storyteller, though her doctors believe she has a slight hysterical tendency. The story is told in the form of her secret diary, in which she records her thoughts as her obsession with the wallpaper grows, and the narrator of the yellow wallpaper is a paradox. As she loses touch with the outer world, she comes to a greater understanding of the inner reality of her life. The inner-outer split is crucial to understanding the nature of narrator's suffering. At every point, she is faced with relationships, objects, and situations that seem innocent and natural, but that are actually quite bizarre and even oppressive. In a sense, the plot of the yellow wallpaper is the narrator's attempt to avoid acknowledge the extent to which her external situation stifles her inner impulses. From the beginning, we see that the narrator is an imaginative, highly expressive woman. She remembers terrifying herself with imaginary nighttime monsters as a child, and she enjoys the notion that the house they have taken is haunted. Yet as part of her cure, her treatments her husband forbids her to exercise her imagination in any way. Both her reason and her emotions rebel at this treatment, and she turns her imagination onto seemingly natural objects, the house and the wallpaper, and is an attempt to ignore her growing frustration. Her negative feelings color her description of her surroundings, making them seem uncanny and sinister, and she becomes fixated on the wallpaper. As the narrator sinks further into her inner fascination with the wallpaper, she becomes progressively more dissociation begins with the story. Thus, at the very moment she decides to keep a secret diary as a relief to her mind. From that point, her true thoughts are hidden from the outer world and the symbolic terms. Gilman shows us this division in the narrator's consciousness by having the narrator puzzle over effects in the world that she herself has caused. For example, the narrator doesn't immediately understand that the yellow stains on her clothing and the long smudge on the wallpaper are connected. Similarly, the narrator fights the realization that the predicament of the woman in the wallpaper is a symbolic version of her situation. At first, she even disapproves of the woman's efforts to escape and intends to tie her up. When the narrator finally identifies herself with the woman trapped in the wallpaper, she is able to see that other women are forced to creep and hide behind the domestic patterns of their lives, and that she herself is the one in need of rescue. The harder of this story is that the narrator must lose herself to understand herself. She has untangled the pattern of her life, but she has torn herself apart in getting free of it. An odd detail at the end of the story reveals how much the narrator has sacrificed. During her final split from reality, the narrator says, "I have got out at last, in spite of you and Jane." Who is this Jane? Some critics claim that Jane is a misprint for Jenny, the sister-in-law. It is more likely, however, that Jane is the name of the unnamed narrator who has been a stranger to herself and her jailers. Now she is horribly free of the constraints of her marriage, her society, and her own efforts to repress her mind. Okay, the next character is John, the narrator's husband and her physician. John restricts her behavior as part of her treatment. Unlike his imaginative wife, John is extremely practical, preferring facts and figures to fancy, at which he scoffs openly. He seems to love his wife, but he does not understand the negative effect his treatment has on her. Though John seems like the obvious villain of the yellow wallpaper, the story does not allow us to see him as a wholly evil. John's treatment of the narrator's depression goes terribly wrong, but in all likelihood he was trying to help her, not make her worse. The real problem with John is the all-encompassing authority he has in his combined role as the narrator's husband and doctor. John is so sure that he knows what is best for his wife that he disregards her own opinion of the matter, forcing her to hide her true feelings. He consistently patronizes her. He calls her a blessed little goose and vetoes her smallest wishes, such as when he refuses to switch bathrooms as not to overindulge her fancies. Further, his dry clinical rationality renders him unequally unsuited to understand his imaginative wife. He does not intend to harm her, but his ignorance about what she really needs ultimately proves dangerous. John knows his wife only superficially. He sees the outer cardboard villain. He cares for his wife, but the unequal relationship in which they find themselves prevents him from truly understanding her and her problems. By treating her as a case or a wife and not as a person with a will of her own, he helps destroy her, which is the last thing he wants. That John has been destroyed by this imprisoned relationship is made clear by the story's chilling finale. After breaking in on his insane wife, John faints in shock, unrecognized by his wife, who calls him "that man" and complains about having to creep over him as she makes her way along the wall. And the last character is Jenny. She is John's sister. Jenny acts as housekeeper for the couple. Her presence and her contentment with a domestic role intensity the narrator's feeling of guilty over her own inability to act as a traditional wife and mother. Janie seems at times to suspect that the narrator is more troubled than she lets on. Okay, guys, let's look at the symbols. The symbol is obviously the wallpaper. It is ripped, soiled, and an unclean yellow. Clearly, the wallpaper represents the structure of family, medicine, and tradition in which the narrator finds herself trapped. Wallpaper is domestic and humble, and Gilman skillfully uses this nightmarish, hideous paper as a symbol of the domestic life that traps so many women. This story, unlike Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde, the theme is duality. This is the psychological story. The story is routine deforming the diary. It is supposed to private. You are supposed to hide a secret. It's kind of an outlet, tragedy, depressed because of she gave birth and also newly married, and her husband goes to rural area and new home for her resting, but her situation should be taken serious. In 18th century, there is no college for women, only for men. Until mid-19th century, the college is for women. Like Janie, a nanny, also a teacher, for educate houses child in these times. Governesses. If a woman rich by herself, the whole money goes her husband, like slavery. And also there is no divorce in these times, Victorian times. Women cannot elect or more play high roles. The women cannot control by own self anything. Everything related with her husband. And her husband as a doctor, he is supposed to most understandable to her depression, but he is most ignorant her depression. He puts on his wife countryside rural house without any neighborhoods, her situation getting worse. There isn't any kind of activity. This is other mistake. There is no cooking, cleaning, reading, etc. He commits her to rest all the time, like a baby. In Victorian times, woman seems to be fragile, emotional, and kind. It's stereotypical. A normal woman fainting isn't typical. Woman isn't silly or weak. Expect the sickness. And Gilman shows us at the end of the story women are strong creatures, intelligent, and the man was shocked and fainted. She criticized society and by presenting her character. The wallpaper symbolized society's stereotypes and the women's presentence and criticism. The woman at the end of the story tearing all wallpaper because of she's strong and real narrator. He forces to his wife sleeping to ugliest room in the house with the cover yellow wallpaper. Colors can also affect you. If you sleep with the yellow, red, orange color, it makes you nervous and depressed. He's thinking about his wife. She suffers from nervous, but her situation is more and more serious. Highly depression, the ignorance of society, stereotypical presence of women. Okay. Themes: the subordination of women in marriage. In the yellow wallpaper, Gilman uses the convention of the psychological horror tale to critique the position of women within the institution of marriage, especially as practiced by the respectable classes of her time. When the story was first published, most readers took it as a scary tale about a woman in an extreme state of consciousness, a gripping, disturbing entertainment, but little more. After its rediscovery, In the 20th century, however, readings of the story have become more complex. For Gilman, the functions of the female and the active work of the male ensured that women remained second-class citizens. The story reveals that this gender division had the effect of keeping women in a childish state of ignorance and preventing their full development. John's assumption of his own superior wisdom and maturity leads him to misjudge, patronize, and dominate his wife, all in the name of helping her. The narrator is reduced to acting like a cross, petulant child, unable to stand up for herself without seemingly unreasonable, reduced to acting like a cross-petulant child and unable to stand up for herself without seemingly unreasonable or disloyal. The narrator has no say in even the smallest detail of her life, and she retreats into her obsessive fantasy, the only place she can retain some control and exercise the power of her mind. The second theme is the importance of self-expression. The mental constraints placed upon the narrator, even more so than she physical ones, are what ultimately drive her insane. She is forced to hide her anxieties and fears in order to preserve the facade of a happy marriage and to make it seem as though she is winning the fight against her depression. From the beginning, the most intolerable aspect of her treatment is the compulsory silence and evilness of the resting cure. She is forced to become completely passive, forbidden from exercising her mind in any way. Writing is especially off limits, and John warns her several times that she must use her self-control to rein in her imagination, which he fears will run away with her. Of course, the narrator eventually insanity is a product of a repression of her imaginative power, not the expression of it. She is constantly longing for an emotional and intelligent outlet, even going so far as to keep a secret journal, which she describes more than once a relief to her mind. For Gilman, a mind that is kept in a state of forced inactivity is doomed to self-destruction. The next one is the evils of the resting cure. As someone who almost was destroyed by S. Weir Mitchell's resting cure for depression, it is not surprisingly that Gilman structured her story as an attack on this ineffective and cruel course of treatment. The yellow wallpaper is an illustration of the way a mind that is already plagued with anxiety can deteriorate and begin to prey on itself when it is forced into inactivity and kept from healthy work. To his credit, Mitchell, who is mentioned by name in the story, took Gilman's criticism to heart and abandoned the resting cure beyond the specific technique described in the story. Gilman means to criticize any form of medical care that ignores the concern of the patient, considering her only as a passive object of treatment. The connection between a woman's subordination in the home and her subordination in a doctor-patient relationship is clear. John is, after all, the narrator's husband and doctor. Gilman implies that both forms of authority can be easily abused, even when the husband or doctor means to help all too often. The women who are the silent subject of this authority are infantilized or worse. And the others, less important themes are limited condition of women at the time. We said that. Patronized, suicide, the present tense, limiting and oppressions of women. There is no rights for women. the ignorance of society, psychological, and women. Okay, guys, that's all. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe me and like and comment. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.